Welcome to Lecture 20 of Communication 1110, and this is going to be the beginning principles of persuasive speaking, and you'll want to read this along with chapters 16 and 17 in the book. We persuade people informally every day, whether we like it or not, sometimes ethically, and sometimes unethically, and sometimes manipulatively. Sometimes with strong reasons based in facts, and sometimes with the other best interests of the other persons in mind. These processes of influence have been studied for many years, even back to 400, 500 BC, and they can be applied to the speeches that you're going to be giving in this class. There are 4 lectures in this set. The first 2 have to do with the structure of your speech and some basic principles, and then the other 2 have to do with logic and logical fallacies. So let's start with some basic preliminary principles of persuasion, and I thought that I would use some alliteration there. First, persuasion is about change. Some people don't like the speech that we have to give in here because of that, because they don't want to try to change people. They don't want to be changed themselves, so they don't want to try to change other people. But let's be honest, you try to change other people every day in some way. And you're not really trying to change them, you're just trying to change a behavior or an attitude or belief that they have usually. Because it's about change, you will have to include more than just information, as you did in your informative speech, but also reasons for changing their minds and their behavior. Second, even though it is about change, persuasion is, people don't like to change. You probably know that. Yes, we all like a vacation every once in a while, but we are more creatures of habit than anything else. We're generally resistant to change. Because we are resistant to change, we don't make a lot of major changes in our lives. Now, some of you have come back to school after being out in the workforce or raising children for a while, but it was a hard decision. There were a lot of things that had to change in your life, your time, your money, your relationships, and we don't make big changes like that very often in our lives. If these things are true that I've just said, it means that a person who is being persuaded to change needs to see that there are benefits to changing, because they're being asked to to pay a cost, to make a sacrifice, to put something into it. So the question is, what's in it for me? Is the cost of the change less than the benefits? Cost-benefit analysis, in a sense. Why should I change if there's nothing good for it, for me in it, or for my surroundings? So you have to keep that in mind as you put your speech together. Yes, these are reasons why you should change, but what's in it for you? Why would it be a good thing for you to change? So taking all this into consideration, as a 5th point, we can see that smaller and concrete, step-by-step, or the word I like to use, incremental change, is really more reasonable in a short speech. This is why, as I mentioned in class, I don't want you to give a speech on abortion, because if somebody in the class is pro-choice, you're not going to change them all the way to pro-life in 8 minutes. I mean, come on. These are things they've thought about for a long time. So you need to pick topics that are asking for small, reasonable, step-by-step changes. In many cases, you'll be asking people to act on what they already say that they believe, and that's really more reasonable for a short speech. You can change people over time, but not in just one kind of a shot deal. You might also try to just get them to consider alternative viewpoints that they have not had in the past. Also, and this brings us to the 6th point, the reasons why a person should change are important, but equally important are the reasons why they don't change. Okay, now that might sound like double talk to you, but let me explain. You probably know somebody that you get in the car with them and say, put on your seatbelt. And they say, no, I'm not going to put on my seatbelt. and you say, oh, but don't you realize, and you go into, you know, the statistics or something, or the government says, or you'll get a ticket, or et cetera, it's good, it's healthy, et cetera. And they say, no, I'm not going to do it because, and they have their reasons for not doing it. Another example that we often have in class is organ donation. You know, from a scientific viewpoint, it makes perfect sense to donate your organs, but not everybody is an organ donor, and they have their reasons why. So the point that I'm trying to get at is that unless you address their reasons why they don't want to change, you can't really, you can't just depend on the reasons why they should change. You've got to address those personal reasons they have that are keeping them resistant. We call those things reservations. Now, this is not reservations like you get hotel reservations. This is, I want to believe you, but I have reservations. Something's holding me back. Yes, I agree with what you're saying, but. It's the yeah, buts is what I call them. So often in a speech, you need to address the yeah, buts, the reservations. Your English teacher might have called this refuting counter-arguments, which is basically what you're doing. Sometimes people have wrong perceptions. They have misconceptions. They've believed myths or something, urban myths that have gone around. So you might have to say in the speech, there are many misconceptions people have. Now, you don't want to say in the speech, if you think this, you're wrong and dumb. No, no, you don't want to do that. But you want to say there are many misconceptions people have about this topic, and then show the other side. Do not mention the yeah buts, the misconceptions, unless you're going to refute them and show why they're wrong. You have to show why they're wrong if you're going to bring them up. So that's that part. The next principle of persuasion is that there is not a hard line between logic and emotion. I know that we've been taught that through Star Trek, you know, that Spock is emotional and is logical and not emotional. But the reality is that in life, we do things for both emotional and logical reasons. Why are you a student at Dalton State College? For logical reasons, factual reasons, and for emotional reasons too. You may not have wanted to move away from home because you like your mom's cooking. Okay, that's not a logical reason, but you know, you're here for that. You had logical and emotional. The next principle is that people make decisions based on the information that they have at hand. Most people do not go out of their way to research something for 6 months before they do it. They make their decisions based on the information they have. That's why it's important in a speech to have lots of good, solid, well-researched information that you can present to people. And in a sense, you're often giving them sort of the first glimpse of the information to sort of get them on the right foot with it. And so it might be information that's primarily on your side. So those are the preliminary principles of persuasion. And I want to move on to the second point of this lecture and talk about good old Aristotle. We bring him up occasionally. Aristotle was a Greek philosopher and scholar, and he laid the foundation for persuasion theory. What he did is he went to the law courts and the assemblies of his day, and he watched people and saw what worked. And he came up with 3 ideas. He called them the 3 methods of persuasion. Now, these are methods of persuasion, not coercion. Coercion would be forcing somebody, threatening them, or giving them a reward or punishment. But these are verbal persuasion methods. And these are logos, and then pathos, and then ethos. And you may have heard of those in another class, but they're very important, and that's why we talk about them in different places. The first one, of course, is logos, and that's the one we're going to deal with in the next 3 lectures, so I'll just leave it at that. But of course, logos, you see the word logic there. It comes from the word word. If you're familiar with the New Testament, the logos is talked about in John 1. It has to do with the order and the rationality and the harmony of the universe, so to speak. So it comes to be about rational reasons, logic, etc., and facts and evidence for your proposition, of which, of course, you should have. The second one is pathos. Pathos, you might see the word empathy, sympathy, and pathos traditionally means emotion. Today, we think of pathos in a more general way. It's not just emotion, although that's part of it, but it's also relating to the needs and the values, the personal aspects of the audience. Why do they do what they do? The motivational part of it more than just the logical part. Use of pathos is necessary in a speech. You don't want to leave that out and just deal with the logical. You won't connect with the audience. Emotional appeals are good as long as they are ethical. They become unethical when the emotion hides the facts and the logic. For example, a charity might show you pictures of sad people, very poor people, or something like that, and people in destitution, and you feel sorry for them, and you should be moved with compassion to help people. But does that charity actually help those people, or are they using the money for other purposes? Just because they can show you pictures of poor people doesn't mean that that's a good charity. That would be an example. How good is their stewardship, etc. There are 3 negative emotions that can be used in persuasion. These are fear, guilt, and anger. Let's talk about guilt and anger first of all. Guilt will motivate people, but not very much on a long term. And usually, let's be honest, if you make people feel guilty, they'll pretty much just ignore you eventually. They'll go out of the way. It's sort of like if you owe someone money, they avoid you. So that's guilt is only good as a short-term motivator. A lot of times at Christmas, we are motivated by guilt to give money to charities because we know we're spending a lot of money on ourselves and we feel bad about that, so we'll help somebody else out. A second negative emotion is anger. And anger does motivate people to do things, unfortunately, but it also causes them to be, the word I would use is frenetic. They just do random things sometimes, things that are not very constructive. So anger is not a constructive emotion. On the other hand, there's the emotion of fear. And while some people might disagree with me, I consider fear a very good motivator because there are a lot of things we do simply out of fear of the consequences. And it's reasonable. You probably don't drive 120 miles an hour on I-75. Why? Well, first of all, because you don't want to get a ticket and pay the fine, and they have a super speeder, so it's an extra fine, like $300 or $400. So it's fear of the consequences. Also, you know that you'll probably hurt yourself or hurt other people. So fear can be a very good motivator in certain situations. You don't want to overdo it. You want to be sure it's backed up by facts and logic, and you don't want to. You want to be sure that your solution addresses the fear. But fear can be useful to a certain extent in a speech as a negative emotion. On the other hand, there are some positive emotions you can use, such as contentment. You can show that the proposition can give the people contentment or pride. You appeal to their pride in their country or their school or their family or their profession. Sympathy, as we've already mentioned, it's a very human emotion. We should feel sympathy and compassion for others, and we can appeal to that. Sadness or avoidance of sadness. So there are positive emotions we can use as well. So do not be afraid of emotions. The real issue, though, is how you can connect your proposition to the needs of your audience. And we've already discussed needs. You recall the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the pyramid that starts with physiological needs and it moves up to safety and security. But I want to talk a little bit about, in terms of utilizing emotions, the idea of motivation. Motivation is misunderstood. We often say, I'm going to motivate somebody in a speech. No, you're not really going to motivate them. You're going to help them motivate themselves because we can't motivate other people. Motivation is something we do to ourselves. Motivation is putting an organism back in balance. When we feel like we're out of balance, we do things to get back into balance. And this is a basic psychological proposition. We don't like being out of balance. And there are, of course, different types of balance for different types of people. Some people, balance is being very healthy. They don't want their blood pressure to be too high. They don't want their weight to be too high. Other people, it doesn't bother them. For me, one aspect of balance is I do not like paying interest charges on Visa bills. You know, when I get my Visa bill, I want to be able to pay that thing off, and I do not want to give any interest money to those companies. But sometimes we get our Visa bills or our MasterCard bills or whatever, and we say, oops, I went a little crazy this month, and it's higher than we thought it was. So now we're out of balance. My balance, which is paying it off, I can't do that. So what am I going to do? I don't want to pay this. I want to get this paid off as much as possible. So when we feel out of balance, we do something, we motivate, we mobilize ourselves to get back into balance. And you can see this fit into a lot of different categories. So I might stop going out to lunch to save money. I might work extra hours at my job. I might ask somebody else for some money. You know, there are ways that we do this, but we will try to get back into balance. So a public speaker, as far as the balance is concerned, will do a couple of things. First of all, you can make the audience, you can give them information to feel like they are out of balance. And this is what advertising does, if you think about it. I mean, advertising is mostly designed to make you feel like you're not good enough, that there's something wrong with you. You have bad breath, you have body odor, you're not sexy enough in your jeans, etc., etc. You're not cool enough because of the beer you drink. Now, those are silly examples, but not really. They are designed to make you feel like you're not good enough, to put you out of balance in some way. Another way is that you can show people that their imbalance is worse than they thought. Earlier, I used an example of a will, getting a will for, and I knew I needed a will for my son, my husband and I did, but I never got one. And somebody should have shown me how bad it was, you know, that I was really out of balance more than I thought I was. And then the third thing is to show that whatever you're doing to create balance isn't working and that there are better ways. So that's what's involved in motivation. You want to show people there's a problem and that there's maybe that they're not even aware of, and bring them into, help them to come back into balance. Some ways that you can use emotion in the speech. There's some good ways and some bad ways. You can show pictures. Pictures are very good to create emotional appeal. You can use stories. That's another very good way. In fact, I would expect you in your persuasive speech to use a good, solid, emotional, motivational story somewhere in the beginning or the end, and especially stories of people experiencing the problem and experiencing the solution. There's some negative ways, though, to create emotion. One is to just make direct assertions, to say, this makes me angry as a speaker, or this makes me fearful. That can work sometimes. Another way is to show emotions yourself, but that can be difficult to do unless it's very sincere. And another very negative way to use emotional appeal is to use name calling. You know, lately it seems like everybody wants to call somebody a Nazi. You know, let's call them a Nazi or a fascist. And that's just name calling, using this emotional word and playing off of that. So another thing that Aristotle talked about, he talked about logos and pathos, but is ethos. Now, we dealt with ethos earlier in the semester, so I'm just going to mention a few things here. As you'll recall, the sources of ethos are competence, character, intention or sincerity, dynamism, which is personal or social attractiveness, and similarity. And a good speaker is aware of these things. Similarity is probably the strongest one that you want to use. And I do want to remind you that ethos comes from it comes from outside of the speech, not just from within the speech. Finally, what can you do to enhance your ethos? You can make your own personal commitment very clear. Don't be bashful. If you're actively involved in the topic, mention it. You want to talk about your credentials. citing your sources, and especially citing sources of people that are familiar to the audience. And delivery is very important. Practice your speech, be very on top of it so that people are not distracted by anything negative that you do. So that's a brief look at ethos, logos, and pathos. In the next lecture, we'll look more at logos.